What's the most terrifying thing that happened to you while camping? Something was watching us. I was 10 years old and with me was my mom, dad, best friend, and our golden retriever, Amber. We were very much an outdoor family and had many camping trips before this and since. But to this day, when I think about it, I still remember the terror I felt that weekend so long ago. This holiday was like many others. We packed up the station wagon with everything we would need for a hike into one of our favorite lakes to camp at. To make this trip even more exciting for me, was the fact it was my birthday weekend, and I got to pick this lake. After we arrived at the trailhead and got our packs on, my dad got his sidearm out and strapped it on his belt. In Oregon, open carry was permitted in national forests, and my dad always had a firearm on his hip while in the woods, which always added a sense of security. We had a close call with a bear one time in which it came in handy. The lake was about a 4-mile moderate hike through some thick forest, but the trail itself was well maintained and was never very busy, so it was going to be a very pleasant hike in. We started off on our hike, and back in the 80s it was not uncommon to have your dog off-leash on the trails in the forest, so we let Amber run and do her thing. We had not seen anyone else on the trail after about 2 miles on the hike, which was nice since it was just all of us talking, laughing, and enjoying nature. My best friend and I started to hike ahead of everyone else because we were so energized and excited about finding the first and best tent spot once we got to the lake. Amber was bounding ahead of us and having a great time too. We were about 20 yards ahead of my parents when Amber stopped dead in her tracks. I thought she maybe saw a chipmunk, or something, maybe a bird, but her hackles came up and she let out the lowest of growls. She never growls, so we stopped walking. We immediately started walking backward and my parents caught up to us. My dad asked us what was going on. I told him that Amber was up the trail and was growling at something. He says it must have been an animal and he did not see anything right off the trail or ahead of us. He says to let him take the lead and we continue to hike. It did not take long before it was forgotten, and Amber and the rest of us are all having a good time again. We arrived at the lake and much to my delight, there was no one else there camping. The water was clean and blue, and the shade from the trees made the whole scene just perfect. My friend and I found the best spot to set up our tent and my parents followed suit. After we had camped set up, my folks went off to fish just down the hill and my friend and I took off with Amber to walk around to the other side of the lake to catch salamanders. We only made it about in 1/8 of a mile when Amber stopped and started to growl. We stopped and looked around and heard brush rustling. Then right in front of us, a man walked out of the trees. Amber stood right by our sides and started to bare her teeth. He was taller than my dad, so at least 6 feet 4 inches, was very skinny, but had very broad shoulders. He was clean cut and was wearing black jeans and a white polo shirt with loafers. He did not look like he had hiked at all or was even dressed for the outdoors. He almost looked like he had come out of church. We just stood there trying to process this situation, when Amber began to bark. The guy just stood there, not moving, and he smiled. The creepiest smile. It felt like someone who thought that was what a smile was supposed to look like. Amber kept barking and this got my parents' attention. They looked up to us and called out to us to come back. We complied and started to walk back towards them. My dad met us halfway and told us to go back to the campsite and he was going to talk to this guy. We got back to our camp and my mom sat with us. I could hear my dad asking the guy if he needed help or if was he a fellow camper who had just set up a camp away from the lake. My dad was being polite and calm, but I could see he was on guard and trying to figure out the situation. Now is the time to mention that my dad was ex-army and can be very intimidating when needed. The conversation continues. The guy told my dad he was just on a walk and did not mean to intrude on us. The guy says goodbye and walks back into the woods. My dad walked back to camp, sat down, and told us that he thinks the guy may just be a new camper and does not know much about the outdoors. But my dad said that he got a weird vibe off him and would be keeping an eye out for him. Amber stayed by our side and was calm, yet she kept looking towards the direction the guy went. A bit more time went by, and we had a nice campfire going and the sun was starting to set. We cooked some dinner and made s'mores afterwards. My friend and I decided to go to our tent and read some books and tell each other some scary stories. Amber followed us to the tent and laid right outside the door. My parents walked down to the lake to sit and have a beer. They were never more than 50 yards away. Not long after my parents walked away, I heard Amber start to growl again, and then we heard footsteps coming from the woods behind our tent. My friend and I turn off our flashlight and go quiet to listen. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the woods. We then hear heavy breathing. Amber starts to bark, and we then hear the footsteps retreat to the woods. Amber whimpers a bit and I then hear my parents walking back to the camp. I go out and tell them what happened. My dad said that he heard Amber barking and that is why they came back up. I asked my dad what we should do. What is going on and if that strange guy was the one creeping around? He told me that we would see about moving camp in the morning since we still had 3 days left on the trip, and nothing had happened to warrant just leaving, but he said that we would play it by ear, and just be a little more vigilant, and if something changes, we will decide what to do next. He tells us to try to get some sleep, and we all turn in for the night. The next morning, we get up and have breakfast. After breakfast, we head down to the lake to fish. It was a beautiful day, and we were having so much fun the events from the prior day were almost forgotten. We decided around lunchtime that we would go for a short hike to the waterfall that is up from the lake. We were gone for only about an hour, and when we came back, we found our tents opened, and our sleeping bags drug out on the ground. My dad tells us to hang back with Mom, and he goes to investigate. He comes back and says nothing is missing, but it was not an animal that did this. He says we should break camp, hike back to the car, and find another spot to camp for the next couple of days. I could tell my dad did not want to frighten us, but I heard the urgency in his voice. I was very disappointed, but if it meant we could enjoy the rest of the trip and not worry about some creep messing with us, then it was worth it. We broke camp and started our hike back. Dad was in the lead, and we were double timing it and made it back to the car in record time. As we walked over to the car, we saw that one of our tires was flat. Not a big deal, we always had a spare, but when my dad bent down to start taking the lugs off, we swore. It was not just flat, someone slashed the tire. Dad changed that tire in record time and we threw everything into the car. As he went to turn the car on, it would not start. He gets out of the car and pops the hood. It turns out someone took our spark plug wires. We were stuck, and no one else was at the trailhead. We were stranded. My parents are calm under pressure, and after a few minutes of discussion, it was decided that Dad would start walking down the road until he could hitch a ride to town and go to the auto parts store. Mom and the rest of us were going to wait with the car and look for someone to hopefully pull into the trailhead and help us. A few hours go by, and no one has come to the trailhead. It is getting hot, and we are hungry and tired. My mom makes us some lunch and we go to sit under a tree to cool off. Amber was by our side and was calm, but then we heard a voice. Amber leaps up and starts to whimper. The creepy guy from yesterday comes down the trail and asks my mom if we need help. My mom tells him we are fine, that it is being settled and my dad will be back soon. This creep then tells her that his camp is close, and he is parked on the old fire road that is near the lake and asks us if we would like to come back to his camp and wait until my dad returns. Mom sternly tells him no, that we will just wait here and thank you anyway. He does not like this. He tells my mom that it is not safe out here for a pretty lady and two young girls. My mom, like my dad, is no pushover and asserts herself again that we do not need any help, and to please just leave us alone. The guy just stands there, smiles wide, and then just turns around and leaves. My mom was visibly shaken, and we girls were just a bit scared. My mom comes over to us and tells us that we need to stay close, not to wander, and that we will be okay. After about another 30 minutes the creepy guy comes back, this time though he is not alone and has a slightly younger guy with him. My mother stands her ground as they approach. Amber starts to low growl and her hackles go up. The two guys flank us, and one of them flashes a firearm tucked into his belt. The older guy told us that we needed to go with them and that they were not asking. My mom backs up next to us and without taking her eyes off them reaches to her belt and pulls out her Bowie knife. My mom said we would not be going and that they needed to leave now. The two men did not even flinch at this and said that we would come with them, or they would drag us with them. At this moment though Amber goes from just growling to barking and puts herself between us and them. This makes the guys stop. My mom yells that they need to leave now. They start backing up and at that moment we hear a truck pulling into the trailhead parking lot. At the sight of the truck, the guys start to walk away fast and disappear into the tree line. The truck was a forest ranger, and he had my dad with him. My dad jumped out of the truck and ran over to us, asking if we were okay. The ranger came over and asked who those men were, and if we were okay. My mom explained everything while my dad hugged us girls and told us we would be okay. The ranger told us these guys attempted to kidnap us. He took off to go looking for the men. My dad tells us that he was about 5 miles from the town when the ranger picked him up and took him the rest of the way to get the part for the car. He then drove him back to our car. After hearing what happened my dad was pissed and wanted to find the guys who tried to kidnap us and that had been terrorizing us for the past 24 hours. The ranger came back and told us that he had almost caught up to them, but they sped away in their truck with a camper in tow. He waited with us until Dad had the car fixed and we were able to leave. We decided to not continue camping and instead drive a couple of hours to spend the last 2 days of the trip at the beach and stay in a hotel. A few days later a deputy called my dad and told him they never did find the men. He said that it was most likely a crime of opportunity after seeing a woman with 2 girls in tow. He was sure they had been watching us from off the trail and had messed with our camp to judge how my dad would react. When my dad seemed to be too big of a threat, they sabotaged our car hoping to put us in a position where we were vulnerable.